and welcome to the third program of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan's 2021 8-week Great Decision Series with topics suggested by the Foreign Policy Association of America. I'm Michael Vindenand. I'm the Executive Director of the Council. On behalf of my colleague Erica Kubik and the Board of Directors of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan, I welcome all of you. Thank you for adjusting with us as we program responsibly in this time of the COVID-19 pandemic. We hope you stay safe and show grace to those in your community. The Council's mission is to empower the people and organizations of West Michigan to engage thoughtfully with the world. We do this with the support of 50 local companies, 11 educational partners, and many community members. Together, we seek to provide programming that is credible, objective, relevant, civil, and compelling. To change the world, we believe, one must first know the world. Tonight we say thank you to Wolverine Worldwide as our series sponsor, and to Blue Lake Radio and the Community Media Center as media sponsors. After Professor Natsios' presentation this evening, there will be ample time for questions. You may type them into the YouTube comments section, or you can text them to 616-308-6560. Please exhibit civility to our guest and hospitality to others by asking respectful and succinct questions. We are very pleased to have Andrew Natsios with us, and we are grateful to him for his flexibility to engage us in this format. Andrew Natsios is an executive professor at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University, and a director of the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs after a long and distinguished career in the U.S. government. Professor Natsios was recently a distinguished professor in the practice of diplomacy at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, and a former administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. As USAID administrator from 2001 to 2006, he managed reconstruction programs in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Sudan. He also served as a U.S. Special Envoy to Sudan in 2006 and 2007. Retired from the U.S. Army Reserves at the rank of Lieutenant Colonel after 23 years, Professor Natsios is a veteran of the Gulf War. From 1993 to 1998, he was Vice President of World Vision USA, the largest faith-based non-governmental organization in the world, with programs in 103 countries. Earlier in his career, he served in the Massachusetts House of Representatives for 12 years and as the Chief Financial and Administrative Officer for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. He is the author of U.S. Foreign Policy and the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, The Great North Korean Famine, and his latest book, Sudan, South Sudan, and Darfur, What Everyone Needs to Know, published in 2012 by the Oxford University Press. He is also co-edited with President George H.W. Bush's Deputy Chief of Staff, Andrew H. Card Jr., Transforming Our World, President George H.W. Bush and American Foreign Policy. His presentation tonight, his conversation with us, is titled, Have You Learned Anything About This Pandemic? We welcome Andrew Natsios, and Andrew, welcome to this gathering of West Michiganders.
Thank you, Michael. It's so nice to be here, at least by Zoom, be here. It's 74 degrees in College Station right now. But thank you very much for your introduction. And let me just give a little advertisement for our book. It came out 3 weeks ago. I don't know how it's going to sell. We hope the timing is right. Because George H.W. Bush's accomplishments in foreign policy, I think, have been understated more since he's died. More and more people are recognizing his skill as a diplomat. And we decided to put together a set of essays on his foreign by the people who ran foreign policy for him. So Jim Baker wrote a chapter. He was Secretary of State. Condi Rice was at the National Security Council. Richard Hawes was also at the National Security Council. And Carla Hills negotiated the NAFTA trade agreement. She wrote a chapter. I wrote a chapter on the intervention in northern Iraq after the first Gulf War. Jim Kunder, who was the head of the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance in AID, wrote a chapter on Somalia. And then Tom Pickering, one of our most distinguished diplomats, wrote a chapter while he on the Bush administration in the United Nations, where he was the ambassador to the UN. And there are 17 chapters by 19 authors. And I think Robert Kaplan read it. And he said, I asked him for an endorsement. And he said, Andrew, I'm not going to endorse it unless I read the whole thing. And he read it. And he said it was a really interesting read and went into detail that it does not appear anywhere else in the historical record of what the president did and how he did it. So that's my little advertisement to begin. That's not what my talk is about, however. So what I want to talk about is COVID-19 and the implications for the world order. We started 6 years ago we call it GP3, Global Pandemic Policy Program in the Scowcroft Institute, because I believe, with many other development practitioners and scientists, that we were going to face eventually a major pandemic. We did not know where it would come from. We didn't know it would be a coronavirus. And I said this on another program, and someone got really upset when I said it. I think it was actually, I was speaking to a group of 60 of the sovereign wealth managers. They have a club in London. And I spoke by Zoom to them, and I said, this is not the real event that we've been predicting. The real event hasn't happened yet. It'll be much, much worse. And they said, how could it be worse? I said, well, it could be like 1918. In 1918, the great influenza killed, in the newest estimates, between 50 and 90 million people over 6 months. Even though it lasted 2 years, the greatest damage was in that 6-month period. That is more, 675,000 Americans died. Now, we just got to 500,000 deaths here, but of course, then we were about, 100 million people. We're 330 million people now. So we're nowhere near proportionally the number of deaths. But this is the worst pandemic since 1918 in the United States. But it's nowhere near 90 million deaths. I actually think the 90 million is a low estimate, because there are large parts of the world we have no idea who died, because they were in remote places. They're colonial empires, and we didn't have transportation systems or communication systems then. But it shut down large parts of the United States without anybody in the government announcing. They simply shut down factories. They shut down shopping districts. People starved to death. Elderly people starved to death in the United States in 1918 because people were afraid to go to their homes with groceries. The streets were empty across the major cities across the United States, empty. It was like when in April of this past year, I drove up to do a show. 100 million people watched it on the pandemic, and I took the risk. I drove all the way up to Dallas. There was no one on the roads. It was completely empty, and people sort of got angry that the government made these decisions. 1918, the federal government was not involved in the response at all. They were not involved in it, and it was regarded as a threat to the mobilization and the conduct of the First World War. And so when the pandemic broke out, Woodrow Wilson said, we're not dealing with this. If you want to read a good account of the 1918 pandemic, there's a book that's won a lot of awards called The Great Influenza by John Barry. It's very readable, and it's very scary. One of the 3 top medical scientists in the United States wrote at the end of the first 6 months, actually, there were 3 waves of the pandemic. The second wave was the most deadly. And he wrote in his own hand, we still have the note, he said, if the acceleration of this pandemic continues at its current level, we could see the end of civilization within a matter of months. That's how scared he was. And he was not a person who exaggerated. I don't know if you know it, but Michigan Medical School is one of the 2 greatest medical schools in 1918 in the country. The other one was the Rockefeller Institute in New York. And the third one was Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. But those three were the centers of research. In any case, it's worth reading it, but because we haven't had that happen. Now, we had an influenza outbreak in the United States that President Bush 43 was worried about. And as a sub-cabinet member, I had to sit through an hour lecture he gave all of us in 2005, when the scientists said we're going to face another 1918. And he read John Barry's book. He got extremely upset. He said, this is not happening under my watch. So he rammed through Congress a $7 billion special appropriation to prepare the country. It didn't happen while he was president. It happened in 2009. You can never predict how the influenza, which is a very unstable virus, will mutate, or the variants, they call them variants, I call them mutations. I'm not a scientist, so I can use that term. But it mutated, so it was the least deadly of any year in the last 30 years. If it had been very deadly, it would have been catastrophic, because 1.9 billion people got the influenza, the flu, in 2009 when we had a pandemic. Most people don't even remember we had a pandemic because it was so mild that it didn't kill many people. It's very, very low death rate. If it had been a high death rate with that number of people getting it, it would have been catastrophic. So we dodged the bullet, so to speak, in 2009, but we didn't dodge it in 2020. And so the first question I want to answer is why are we having these diseases? We had Ebola 4 or 5 years ago. We had HIV/AIDS, it's still going on, but President Bush intervened on that in a highly successful way to contain that. We've had MERS, Middle East respiratory illness, and respiratory syndrome, that is a coronavirus, just as COVID-19 is a coronavirus. And then there's SARS. SARS is also a coronavirus that is the most closely related to COVID-19. So genetically, or the DNA of the two viruses are like 70% the same. And SARS is also from China. COVID-19 is from China, as you know. There's this debate the Chinese are trying to say that it started in Europe or something, and they're claiming that it attached itself to some frozen salmon, and that's utter nonsense. There is not one single piece of evidence that one person has been infected from food, even though we keep all of these rules about wiping our hands when we go to eat and washing our hands. And we should do that. That's why the flu, by the way, the reason the flu season was very, very weak this year, very small, is because everybody's washing their hands and wearing masks, which is good in terms of the flu. It's not just in terms of COVID-19. But the reality is that it's spread, we now know, by ingesting it through the respiratory system. It attaches to the ACE2 receptor. It attaches itself to the outside of this receptor in a protein, and then that's how it makes its way into our system. That's how it affects us. And some people, it only affects their respiratory system, but other people, a smaller percentage, it affects their circulatory system, their heart, and their neurological system. It infects their brain. And there is evidence, substantial evidence now, that's not just a few cases of it, that it does brain damage. And we think, based on MERS and SARS, that it may be permanent brain damage. I'm sorry to tell some of your listeners that, but some of the people who are having neurological side effects may have them for a long time. SARS and MERS, they stopped tracking the neurological damage done because it didn't change after 5 years. It was still the same. So we think it's permanent. In those two cases, they're coronaviruses. We think it may be permanent in this case too. I'm sorry to tell you that. Now, that's a small number of cases. 80% of the people who get it do not have severe symptoms, but 20% do, and they're the ones at risk. They're the ones sent to the emergency rooms, and maybe 3% of them die. Now, the big problem we're facing is that we didn't think originally that this was going to mute. We thought it was a very stable virus. It's not as unstable as the flu, but it's creating, there are now, I think there are 19 variants or mutations. There's one in Britain, there's one in South Africa, there's one in Brazil. WHO has now found 7 variants in China alone. of the 19. And the one in Britain is the most worrying because that's spreading across the United States right now. It's more than twice as infectious. It does not, it will kill a lot more people if we don't get immunized, but it in and of itself, it is not more deadly. But it will kill more people because it's more infectious, more people will get the disease. Okay, so why are we seeing all of these diseases? There's been a big increase the last 40 years. Well, number one, and this is one of the explanations for why we have been hit so hard by it. And people are all wondering, they say, well, the federal government's to blame. The federal government has nothing to do with it, okay? There are 175,000 flights a day in the world, air flights. You know how many of those are in the United States? 45,000 a day, before COVID-19, I mean. So this is in 2019. That's the last statistic that was unaffected by the virus. A quarter of all of the air flights in the world are in this country, domestically and internationally. Guess we have invented the most efficient way of spreading respiratory viruses. It's called the international and domestic airports. People want to wonder why it spreads so fast. It's because we travel more by air in this country than any country in the world, by far, by far. Now, the other, we have other comorbidities that are related to obesity. People who are obese have high blood pressure, and anybody, I have high blood pressure. I'm not obese, but I've had it under control for like 30 years. I've been taking medication, as many Americans have, but only about 25% of the people who have high blood pressure are being treated for. They don't even know they have it, and they are much more vulnerable. Anybody who's had a heart attack or cancer are much more vulnerable to the disease. But if you're obese, you have a much higher risk of dying, even if you're young. It's irrespective of age. And so older people are much more vulnerable. We know that. And the infection rates are going down now because they are now immunizing all the people most at risk, which is very wise. And so the first reason why we're vulnerable is because of air travel. And it's not just in the United States, it's worldwide. We've created this globalization, in fact, has made the world system more integrated and more connected. And that means the viruses spread much faster. Two, people think that globalization has been oppressive and all. The far left and the far right, it keeps attacking globalization. Well, I'm sorry, but as a development professional, that's just nonsense. In fact, we are living, I know people get very upset when I say this on the far left and the far right. We are living through the greatest golden age for the people, the common people of the world that civilization's ever experienced. There's been a larger drop in poverty, starvation deaths, illiteracy, and life expectancy has dramatically risen, not just in the rich countries, but in middle income countries, even some poor countries, very poor countries. And the result of that is that because the people have more money, they're buying more meat and more dairy products. 70% of the diseases that have affected people, new diseases in the last 40 years, are zoonotic diseases. They are diseases from animals that make the jump to people, and then they efficiently spread from one person to another. So the second great powerful thing is the consumption of animals and the huge increase in the number of domesticated animals. The third is urbanization. In 1949, China was 90% rural, 10% urban. Today, it's 60% urban, 40% rural. And people are crowded into cities, many of which do not have clean water, and they do not have properly functioning sewer systems. Chinese are trying to build them, but they don't have them. And Paul Collier, speaking of Bush School, the author of the best-selling book called The Bottom Billion, and Paul was saying that in Great Britain, industrialization and urbanization in the 19th century led to a catastrophic health crisis in Britain. And I think he said in 1840, the average life expectancy in Great Britain was 19 years old. 19 years old. It's difficult to imagine that. And that's because they had no public water systems and no sewer systems in these cities that were growing like London. And they built them because one industrialist spent his fortune on advocating for this and spending it in his home city. And so that's what happened in the United States as well in the late 19th century. And that saved us. We did not have a disease theory of, or a virus theory, bacteria theory of disease in those days, germ theory of disease in those days. That is something that was invented in Germany and France in the 1840s and 50s. It spread to the United States in the 1870s. Harvard Medical School, no offensive to any doctors on the line who went to Harvard Medical School, in 1900, they were practicing quackery. Scientific medicine was not being practiced in almost any of our medical schools except for the three I mentioned. Michigan Medical School, which I think was associated with one of the universities, Rockefeller Institute, and Johns Hopkins, and that's it. The rest of them were still bleeding people as a way of treating disease. Anyway, so urbanization has meant more people live in these closed-in areas. If there was an Ebola outbreak in Africa in a remote village of 100 people, and everybody died in the village, or half the village died, they didn't spread it to other people because the next village was 5 miles away and there was no means of getting there. And so when Ebola broke, because Ebola has been around for decades, it blew up because it got into urban areas in Liberia and Sierra Leone and Guinea in 2014, I think it was, when the epidemic started. Killed, I think, something like 11 or 12,000 people because it went into urban areas. Africa is rapidly urbanizing. I am very worried. But the other reason for that is urban areas are now impinging on the areas of wild animals, particularly bats and other wild animals that spread various diseases. There are about 20,000 viruses that have been identified around the world. And about 2,000 of them might be a problem for us. These are animal diseases, are mostly viruses. And about 200 of them have a real risk to us. And we've never had any pandemics in many of them before. But urbanization is connecting us with the wild animal population, and the domesticated animals, we're eating them. And in many developing countries, they live with their animals. And then the final thing that I would mention is that the mass media is now such that it is sharing. I mean, we now have more evidence of scientific knowledge than we've ever had before. And one of the extraordinary things about what's happened with COVID-19 is the scientists around the world, regardless of nationality, are sharing their research with each other. And that's a great boon. But the other boon is there are a lot of rumors going around that are complete nonsense. And that people, some of the people read the stuff on the internet, they believe it. And the trust in science has eroded. And that is very dangerous, frankly, because who do you trust to take advice from? And so one of the problems we're facing right now is the vaccine hesitancy movement. We call it that. Because there are people, we understand why they're hesitant. But I have to just tell you, if we don't immunize our people against the diseases we now have vaccines against, we're going to be back to 1900 when the average life expectancy was 46 years. It's now 79 years, although we lost 6 months because of COVID-19. So the question is, what do we do about this? And was the international system working properly? And if it wasn't, what do we need to change it? We cannot contain, it should be very clear by now, you cannot stop a pandemic at a national border. You can slow it down. One thing that could have been done, but no one thought of it, is to shut down every single airport in the country. But that would have paralyzed the industry, and the economy would have been in much worse shape. We just stopped flights abroad. We didn't realize part of the reason it was spreading within the United States was because of all these domestic air flights across the country. So did the system work? It did not work. And I'll tell you why it didn't work. Now, people, I don't want to be associated with anybody who is attacking the UN just because they don't like international. I like international organizations. However, many of them are dysfunctional. There are some, like the World Food Program, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNICEF, they're highly functional and very competently led and run and have been for many years. But there are others that are not. WHO, we need for standard setting, for research, but they have not developed an operational capacity to respond to emergencies. Actually, UNICEF, whenever we in the aid community want to respond to a health emergency somewhere, we go through UNICEF. We do not go through WHO because they can't send people into the field rapidly to get stuff done in the ground. National immunization campaigns are not run by WHO, they're run by UNICEF, which is a UN agency. So what's the problem with WHO? And people blame Dr. Dr. Tedros is a very able guy. He was a health minister in Ethiopia. I've met him a couple of times. I don't know him at all personally, other than talking to him for a few minutes. But he is regarded by the career people in USAID and the NGO community as one of the most able health ministers in Africa. He was the head of the Global Fund for HIV/AIDS, TB, and malaria for a number of years before he became the Director General of WHO. So what was his problem? Well, the first problem is he was elected, okay? Instead of appointed by the Secretary General, he was elected, and the Chinese government got behind him and recruited people to vote for him. So he owed something to the Chinese. That's indisputable that happened. I think he used intemperate language or very weak language early on when the Chinese refused to cooperate in the first few months of this. But if he hadn't, the Chinese would have just ignored him. They're a great power. I mean, they're not a little country you can push around. But the other problem with WHO is much more serious, and it had nothing to do with Dr. Tedros. It has to do with the design of WHO in the 1940s. When WHO was created in the 1940s, when the UN was being created, we already had developed a regional North and South America or Latin American health organization. It was called PAHO, Pan American Health Organization. Its headquarters is literally right next to the State Department in downtown DC. It's a modern round building from the 1960s. No offense to the architect, but it's not one of the great pieces of architectural wonder in Washington. But it's very competent. It's very competent. And PAHO said, well, we don't want WHO in our area. We already have a WHO. That's us. That's cooperating and doing all the same thing. So WHO said, okay, we will let you in, we'll merge with you. And WHO said, we'll give you regional autonomy. So we can't do anything in your region without your approval. So the most decentralized of all 62 UN agencies, the last time I counted, there may be more now, is WHO. Why? Because of this peculiar historical circumstance that all the regional offices can veto responses. Now, this is, by the way, for those of you, or those of us who work with WHO and know the structure, know this is not a debatable issue. This is absolutely true. And there's been repeated attempts by the United States to fix this. And the countries around the world, the developing world in particular, refuse to go along with the reforms. The Director General cannot declare an emergency anywhere in the world without the approval of the regional office. And the reason why Ebola got out of control is the West Africa WHO office said, it'll damage the economy if you declare a disaster. And so we refuse to allow you to do that, and you cannot send teams out, and they vetoed the whole thing. If someone had vetoed that when I was the aid administrator from the mission, I'd fire the director. You can't do that in WHO because the deputy directors and the regional directors are all elected by the central governing body, the 30 people, not by the Director General. It's as though the president's cabinet was confirmed and elected by and chosen by the Congress. And so the president's cabinet didn't really report to him, which is ridiculous. Okay, if you want an executive authority, you need a Director General who has control over his management team. He doesn't have any control. And this is not just Dr. Tedros, this is all his predecessors since 1946 or 47 when WHO was created. Now, I have talked to people who said, Andrew, this is not the first time. Ebola was not the first time this screwed up. It screwed up before that. Now, Dr. Brundtland, who was a medical doctor, she's the former prime minister of Norway. There was an instance where there was an outbreak somewhere and the regional office said, we refuse to allow this, a response. And she I don't want to use her language, but she basically said to tell them to go to hell She sent the team out, declared the emergency in violation of the rules. And the only reason she didn't get censured, I think, is because she was right. Okay. I remember when my friends of mine and I blew the whistle on what was happening in Darfur, the regional office of WHO was controlled by the Egyptian Foreign Ministry, condemned our statement that atrocities were going on in Darfur. And they said, it's all a lie. You've made it all up. You're anti-Arab. I said, I'm not anti-Arab, I'm pro-Arab. But this is going on, and this Bashir government is involved in it. The WHO office, I don't know why they're even making statements. You know, there was health elements to this, but this is none of their business, in fact. They made a public statement because the Egyptian government wanted them to make a statement, and they had control over the regional office. So there is a structural problem that needs to be fixed, and this is not being discussed. You don't fix it by withdrawing from WHO, but just by joining is not going to fix it. So we need to make a clear, indisputable statement to WHO. We're going to withdraw support. We'll be in it, but we're not going to give you financial support unless this system is fixed. And it's not up to the Director General and the staff in Geneva, Switzerland to fix this. This is a problem with the protection of national sovereignty in the developing world, where they want control over whether disease outbreaks are being announced or not. And I mean, and China is not a developed, I mean, you could say it is a developing country in some ways. It's South China, West China is poorer than much of Africa. But China didn't want WHO mucking around with their stuff. And the consequence is we have a giant mess in our hands. Okay, the other thing that's a problem is we do not have an early warning system. There is an early warning system in WHO. It does not work. It's called GOAR. I don't even remember what it stands for, GOAR. We had a paper written by the retired Deputy Director General of WHO who explained how the system worked. And I said, well, it didn't work for Ebola, it didn't work for HIV/AIDS, and it didn't work for this. He said, yes, it did work for a couple of other outbreaks, Andrew. It is designed properly. The problem is they keep getting vetoed by the regional offices, the responses. So what I propose in an article for Foreign Affairs that I wrote in July, it was published in Foreign Affairs in July. It's called We Need a Pandemic Early Warning System. And it's modeled, what I propose is modeled after the USAID Famine Early Warning System, which was established after the Ethiopian famine of 1985 that killed 900,000 people. And it's been extremely effective. And I might add, Alex DeWall is one of the leading scholars on famines, has written a wonderful book. Well, it's a depressing book, but it's a great piece of scholarship and writing called Mass Starvation, in which he has tracked starvation deaths in the last 150 years. And he's shown a very substantial decline in the number of starvation deaths from famines. And he said there are three reasons for that. And one of them is the International Humanitarian Response System, which is basically set up under George H.W. Bush. People don't know that. But it was set up in the late 80s. That's when there's been a precipitous decline in starvation deaths. The famine early warning system has predicted every single famine except for the one in North Korea, and they weren't covering North Korea in those days. They cover the whole world now. So I suggest we use the same model. Now, what is the model? One is countries that are most vulnerable to pandemics because they have weak health systems and they're autocracies that do not want to share bad information. In China, it's very interesting. We looked into the Chinese system for reporting disease for their provincial directors, and I don't know what the title is, but the county officials. And if infection rates they have categories of disease. If infections go above a certain level, you get penalized in your salary. Okay? And so I said, well, I understand that's a good incentive, except for one problem. The county officials are the ones reporting the data. So what did the county officials do? They don't report when the data goes up because they don't want their salary cut. Okay? It's called a perverse incentive. It's a terrible system. Now, in a democracy, democracies are very messy. We're seeing that with the implementation of the vaccine program. But you can't keep a secret in democracy very long. It gets out. Why is it? There's newspapers, there's civil society, there's academics, there's the internet, there's Congress, there's the 50 state legislatures, there's city councils. You just can't suppress information. In a totalitarian or autocratic regime, you can. And you can keep it secret long enough that it can blow up. Now, a group of scientists at Harvard did a study using remote sensing on when the pandemic actually started in China. It's absolutely fascinating study. And what they showed is that the first thing they looked at is they looked at aerial photographs going back 4 months to August through December of last year, not last year, the year before, like 2019. And they found a large increase in the number of people going into health clinics in the greater Wuhan area. So if you look at the aerial photographs, the satellite photos, but you can get commercially, they're not the US spy satellites are extraordinarily, I can tell you, I can't go into details of that, but they're extraordinarily precise on seeing things on the ground. But you can get commercial photographs that will tell you whether people are going to health clinics and hospitals. There was a big increase beginning at the end of August of 2019. Now, that doesn't mean it's for COVID-19, but they married that data from aerial photography, from, we call it remote sensing, with data from Twitter, which you can also buy commercially. And they looked at the question of the unique symptoms of COVID-19. Did it start appearing in Twitter accounts in the greater Wuhan area? They also started at the end of August. So if you show an increase in people feeling sick enough they go to the hospital or health clinics with data on symptoms on Twitter, you can tell something's bad's happening, even if you haven't identified the genome of the virus, okay? And you can start making public statements about it. Now, what's happened with the WHO team that's in there now, they made a deal with the Chinese government, which is unfortunate because it's damaging WHO's credibility now, that we're looking at whether or not this thing originated in Europe. It did not originate in Europe. There is absolutely no evidence. There are people who got the disease in France, but I got to tell you, you know who built the BSL-4 lab? BSL-4 labs are the highest level of security for labs that are testing extremely dangerous pathogens. That's BSL-4 is the highest level, and there's 3 and there's 2 and all that. And China built their first lab in Wuhan. Guess who built it? The French did. Okay? And that's where this theory comes from, that the lab was the source of this. Now, this was a sort of a right wing, the President Trump kept saying this and sort of discredited this among scientists. Oh, he's saying it can't be true. Well, I actually did some research last April. I published a private paper for one of the big law firms that asked me about it. And I went and asked I looked at Chinese scientists' websites on the Chinese universities. A whole bunch of Chinese scientists said, oh, this was a leak from the BSL-4 lab. These are Chinese scientists now. None of them were American scientists that I quoted in the article. This leaked out of the BSL-4 lab. We have cables that were declassified to embarrass the Chinese, but they're legitimate cables out of Beijing because CDC and USAID was providing technical assistance to the BSL-4 lab to improve their safety. And they were not following the safety protocols. We know that because of these cables. The cables saying from the State Department, the embassy, this is ready to blow up. If this doesn't, this is from like 3 years ago. This is not recent, or two or 3 years ago, these cables. So we can tell from remote sensing if there's a problem. And I advocated that AID set up a pandemic early warning system, use remote sensing like we do for famines, because we use satellite photos of famine-prone areas all over the world to see whether the crop is brown when it should be green, because that tells us there's been a crop failure. And then we send teams into the ground, on the ground, to see if food prices are rising in the markets. We have a lot of, like 15 indicators of famine approaching before it happens. We know it's going to happen before it happens. And so you're able to intervene, and AID has a huge part of it that does emergency response and preventative response to prevent something from getting out of hand. So I argue that AID should legally be given the authority in the developing world to respond to these emergencies, but to run the early warning system the way it does for famines. Anyway, the last comment I want to make is just a historical reference. The one disease, and human disease, that we have that wiped out off the face of the earth by human efforts was smallpox. Smallpox killed at least 300 million people in the last century, maybe as many as 100 million. It was endemic all over the world. Now, we've had a vaccine in the United States and Western Europe for, I don't know, a century or more, but they didn't have it in the developing world. And so in the 1960s, we had a couple of people who got infected with smallpox in New York City. I think it was in the 50s, maybe it was in the 1950s, late 50s. And it caused mass panic because it's an extremely deadly disease. And so we didn't have pandemics of smallpox because everybody just got it. It was like the flu, it was there all the time. Well, in any case, in the 1960s, the US government got together with the Soviet government in the 1960s, the height of the Cold War, and said, you are as much at risk as we are. We need to wipe this thing out. They used WHO to orchestrate it. USAID and CDC had a marriage of convenience because there's tension between both organizations. I won't go into that. And the Soviets had the same problem, okay? But we all worked together. And in 1977, we had our last case of smallpox. There's been no smallpox for 43 years. It has been wiped out. And it was through great power cooperation. I was hoping before COVID-19 that the one area we might work with the Russians and the Chinese on, despite all the competition, was in health. But I have been unfortunately mistaken because now this has become part of great power competition. The Chinese are all over Africa offering everyone vaccines if they will vote with the Chinese on the Uyghurs, on Tibet, and on Hong Kong, and Taiwan, which is very dangerous. And they're getting, countries are desperate for vaccines, and they said, okay, we'll vote with you at international bodies. And the Chinese are using the vaccine as leverage in I think, an abusive way. And that's unfortunate. But part of the reason we're doing it is because we refuse to join in the international effort to provide vaccines to the developing world, which I think was a terrible mistake. And more countries, populism on the left and the right is focusing us internally instead of externally. And I think that these variants are taking place because everybody's not immunized. Unless we can stop the disease from spreading, we're going to have more and more variants, and some of them could be very dangerous. We don't know. Anyway, I'm now 15 minutes over what I said I would do. So we now have about 15 or half an hour for questions.
Oh, it's been fascinating, though, Andrew. Thank you. Thank you. You are quite a storyteller and chock full of very important information. I mean, this has been very fascinating. Thank you. And folks, you can join into this conversation by texting 616-308-6560, or you can type your questions into the YouTube chat comment box, and we will get to them. I want to start. This is incredibly fascinating, this early warning system that you wrote about and that you've been talking about. So what are some of the trackable indicators that could suggest that a pandemic was upcoming? You talked about it was hospitalizations or hospital visits?
Well, in many developing countries, there aren't many hospitals. There are health clinics.
Okay.
So tell if there's an increase in the number of people going to health clinics. That's one thing,
Okay.
particularly in the poorest countries.
Yeah.
I'll tell you another thing that's very sad, but in famines and in pandemics, when a large number of people die, they cannot bury them all in individual graves, so they have mass graves. When bodies are decomposing, they produce health signatures from the air. And so our spy satellites can see if there's mass graves. They come up really, really strongly on the ground. In fact, the Clinton administration tracked the atrocities committed during the Srebrenica massacre by finding mass graves, and they used aerial photographs, CIA photographs, actually geospatial agency photographs, to identify where they were. And then they went and excavated them to find the bodies. And so that's another way you could do it. But another thing, AID, for example, has a chain of health clinics and hospitals and health ministries, all and NGOs we work with on health issues. A third of the entire 28 AID's budget is 20 billion, but the total aid budget for the whole federal government is like 30 billion, 32 billion. A third of that is health in the developing world. And so we have vast resources and programs all over the world. And what I've advocated, not in the article, but we should be creating a chain of tens of thousands of health clinics on the ground that will automatically report even before the central government may know what's going on, so they can't stop the reporting from these health clinics that we're associated with. And we help fund, actually. We don't actually help fund them per se. They're funded by the ministries, and some of them are private. In India, a lot of the health clinics are private, maybe 50% of them, as I recall. So that's another thing we could do to gather information. But there's a vast network of NGOs where hundreds of thousands of people work for NGOs. Actually, yes, more than hundreds. It's a couple of million people work for NGOs all over the world. And they are sources of information, huge source of information, particularly on health issues.
So what you're advocating for U.S. aid to get the permission to set up a pandemic early warning system like they have an early warning system for famine. Well,
you wouldn't need permission. AID can just do it.
Oh, okay.
They have money. The emergency office does not have earmarks in it, which the rest of aid does. But the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance does not have any earmarks. They have money to do it, and it would not cost that much money. I know how much the famine early warning system costs, and it's very doable. In fact, they have a bid out now. It's called a request for information to begin the research on doing a system of some kind. But I think, people will say, well, what if the Europeans set up one? And what if WHO reforms itself? There's no problem with having multiple systems, because if one system fails, maybe the other one won't. We can't all rely on one international reporting system. We know that because human beings, I'm sorry, I'm being a little theological here. People are fallen. There's flaws in the human character, and therefore the institutions that we've built have flaws in them. There always will, frankly. And some of them are designed deliberately to be flawed, and they have dysfunction in them. And so we cannot rely on one early warning system. We need multiple early warning systems. The CIA, by the way, is thinking of having one. The problem with the CIA is they don't share their information with AID or the State Department on this stuff. They're doing this to tell the president what's going on. I think AID should be independent of whatever the CIA develops, because the purpose of AID is to respond. CIA doesn't go out and do responses to pandemics. That's not their job. It's AID's job to do that. But if you don't know the pandemic's going on, how do you do that? And the other problem is the CIA does not have the resources at the grassroots level that AID has, or the health expertise either. That's my view. And we need to get CDC involved in this too, but I think AID should run the system because they're more operational than CDC is.
Now, the WHO obviously has lost a lot of credibility through all of this, but in the U.S., there seems to be a lot of suspicion of foreign aid in general. So as soon as you talk about U.S. aid getting involved, there are some Americans who will say, "Well, wait a minute, you're pouring money into aid outside of the United States. We need to help here," so on and so forth. How do we build this case? You talked about this, and there's a Prism article that talked about this.
Yeah.
How do we build the case that what people think is aid coming out of the U.S. to help others really is doing both? It is helping others, but it's also providing us with those early warning systems.
That's the argument I made, is a great power realist argument for foreign aid, that it's not just to improve life for people in the other world, around the world, poor countries. It is to do that. It's in their interest, but it's also in our interest. It's in our interest to make sure these pandemics don't start in the first place. And how do you do that? You build health infrastructure in developing countries, and we've been doing that. And I think things would be much, much worse than they are now if we hadn't built this whole infrastructure on health through the aid programs that we, but the Europe, the other thing is people say, oh, the Europeans are not carrying their weight. Well, I'm not going to make comments on whether they do or not on the military side. The Europeans give a far larger percentage of their GDP for their aid programs than we do. We're ranked 22nd. We are not the most generous country at all. Privately, we give a lot of money, but not through the federal government. And I have to say, the best investment we could possibly have is more development assistance. Jim Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, who I have great respect for, he said, the more you cut aid, the more bullets I'm going to have to buy. This is when he was Secretary of Defense. No, actually, he said that when he was a general, I think, when he was a four-star. And I think that's true. Bob Gates, when he was Secretary of Defense, he said something like the same thing. There are more foreign service, there are more people in Army bands than there are in the Foreign Service and AID and state. Can you imagine that? In Army bands. So there's a problem in terms of how much we're investing in different sectors. Now, I have to tell you, when you tell people in polling data, the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations does studies on this, the American people, do you support reducing illiteracy in the developing world? 80% of the American people say, yes, we do. Do you support reducing disease in the developing? Do you support giving agricultural aid to people so they can eat better? 80% approve it. And what they don't approve of is giving aid to dictators who then steal it. Almost none of the aid money, the only aid countries that allies of ours that get aid where we give it to the government is Egypt, Jordan, in Israel. I think they're the only countries in the world. We don't give money. We work with the government, but not through the government, because we've had accountability problems before. We work through a network of universities, NGOs, international organizations like UNICEF and the World Food Program, and private companies. We work through a lot of private for-profit companies that do very good work in the developing world. And so I think part of the problem with the public perception of aid is they don't understand how the system works, and that we go too far, actually, in the accountability, if you can believe it. We're spending huge amounts of money to make sure nothing's stolen. I think too much, actually. That's a very controversial thing to say, but I've said it in an article that I've written some years ago, that the accountability systems in the US government to control corruption in aid programs are extraordinary. They're much better than any other aid agency in the world.
This question from a listener, are we likely to improve our supply chain system through more emphasis on the PPE supply, production, and distribution in the future? We don't seem to learn from one disaster to the next, the listener is saying.
They're absolutely correct. We do have a strategic reserve of medical pharmaceuticals. It's actually classified what's in it. So I think I know what's in it, but we certainly don't have vaccines that don't exist. So there was no vaccine for COVID-19 because the disease didn't exist as a threat to us. So there was no way of keeping that. However, there is a huge problem with pharmaceuticals. And this is a controversial question. The big pharmaceutical companies don't like me saying this, but I'm sorry, I'm pro-capitalist. I actually think the pharmaceutical companies saved us, but they can be very parochial sometimes, all right? They set up this system, globalized system. It's highly efficient, keeps prices down. But the problem is, if one part of the system fails, the whole system fails. And people don't know this. We wrote an article that was published in 115 newspapers and media outlets around the world. In fact, the health minister of Germany quoted the Scowcroft Institute article on this, on supply chains. And we did an article that appeared in the Washington Post and Newsweek on this subject. 70% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients, which is the part of a pill that we take, or a shot or whatever, that actually makes the difference medically. There are other things that go into a pill that are stabilizers and all that. The active pharmaceutical equipment ingredients in 70% of our prescribed drugs are made in China, and we think, we're not sure, that they're all made in the greater Wuhan area. So not only are they concentrated in China, they're concentrated in one city in China, and it happens to be the place that the pandemic started. Now, people say, well, it didn't have any effect. It did have an effect. The Food and Drug Administration announced, I think it was last June or July, that 23 drugs that were critically important, and some of us all take, like Lipitor and there are heart medications we take, and diabetes medications that are produced in these fat, and the reason they're at risk is not the Chinese were hoarding them. They shut the factories down because of the pandemic. And the Indian, we also produce a lot of drugs in India, and India announced that they're going to stop exporting any drugs because they needed them for the Indian population, which I understand. I think we need to have, for national security reasons, just like we do for our weapon systems. We don't have the Chinese building our weapon systems. We would never do that. Okay? It's a national security issue. We need to have our critically important pharmaceuticals produced in the United States, or maybe Canada and Mexico with NAFTA, or whatever the new NAFTA agreement is called. But I would prefer even in the United States. The problem is all these factories shut down because we transferred all this technology over several decades now. I think it's over the last 20 years, actually, to the developing world, particularly India and China, but particularly China. And I think we need to review those supply chains, because this system is highly efficient, but it has tripwires in it that no one ever understood, and that we now realize are putting our entire business infrastructure at risk. I think many companies now are going to begin to review whether or not this was, because they don't even know, many companies do not know where all the component parts of a particular thing they produce come from. They're not all, people think they have these elaborate maps of where all this, they don't even know themselves. So
here's a question about South Africa. Would you be willing to comment on the prudence of the South African government's recent decision to divert AstraZeneca elsewhere and wait for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine to arrive?
Well, I don't know all the elements of the decision, okay? I would not be doing that if I were them. Now, the Chinese have these vaccines and the Russians have vaccines. The Ministry of Health in the Congo prohibited any of the Russian vaccines for Ebola from being used in the Congo. They said, we'll only accept the American, I think it's Merck that produced it. It's actually highly effective. And they've been immunizing all the people in the area. One of the problems is the vaccine hesitancy movement is people are scared to take it because they think it's going to poison them or something. And so the problem with waiting is that there will be more variants as the disease spreads, and that it could produce all of a sudden a variant that is very much more deadly, that has a much higher death rate. The death rate, we won't know until this is all over, but we think the death rate is maybe between 0.5% and 1% of the people who get infected die. Okay, that's actually a relatively low rate. Ebola is between 50 and 60% death rate. You get Ebola, you're a toast, particularly if you're in a developing country and there's no medical care. So if this were to mutate to 10%, it would be terrible, terrible. So we do not want variants. So we should be mass producing this stuff and immunizing everybody as soon as we possibly can, because we do not want these variants developing. It's very dangerous.
There's a question going back to the early warning system. I think you answered this question before, but let's revisit it a minute. Somebody's asking how this system will work. When you when you do famine warning systems, you can look at fields, you can look at the brown or the green fields and whatever. But what I heard you saying is that, for example, two of the elements of an early warning system for a pandemic would be hospitalizations, traffic to hospitals. And you also talked about analyzing data from Twitter about what symptoms, what are people asking about in terms of symptoms. Did I get that right? Are those?
You did. And let me just say this is a controversial subject because of privacy.
Okay. Oh,
however,
yeah.
there are big corporations in the United States, without mentioning the names, that have developed algorithms for analyzing what's called big data. There is massive amounts of data that are available. And you know who is specializing this? The Chinese. And the Chinese are not doing it necessarily just for bad things. They're doing it because they're worried. If they have a pandemic in their country with high death rates that's highly infectious, it could devastate Chinese cities. And they know it. They know it. So, but there are other reasons they're developing. They want to be more advanced than we are in terms of our medical equipment, without going into all the details of what kind of equipment, but they are now racing ahead of us in terms of diagnostic equipment that's easy to move around and easy to use and cheap to make. And they're doing that deliberately. And so they bought a lot of these CRISPR machines so that they can do gene splicing, which is another area of concern I have personally. So you can use algorithms to analyze massive amounts, and that data is already available. It's already available through Twitter, through Facebook, through Google and all that. They're already reading all our emails and everything else for their own commercial purposes. But you can buy that. You can go down and buy it right now. You don't have to go through you don't have need legislation for it. So if you develop the right algorithms with one of these companies that specialize in the analysis of big data, and this is not just big data for the United States, this is big data for the whole world, because people use Twitter all over the world. They don't just use it in the United States. We can actually tell whether diseases are developing because people complain about their symptoms.
Interesting. Is there any other element to that early warning system we talked about?
Well, I think there is. I'll tell you what's fascinating. In the Bush White House, we had it, and then the Obama people shut it down. And then I thought Trump would start it. They didn't start it. I think it was a mistake. You know, one way of telling whether or not things are deteriorating very rapidly is we can get real-time data from all the drugstores in the United States, in fact, all over the world, in whether people are buying aspirin or Tylenol or Advil or the equivalent. And if there's a big spike, all of a sudden, within 3 days and 1 week versus the week before, and it wasn't like that for the previous year, something's going on. So the purchase of pharmaceuticals, including over-the-counter pharmaceuticals, will tell us whether something is developed because people's behavior is changing.
That's fascinating.
Now, I'll tell you one way we use it for. They also stopped doing this, which I think was a mistake. The avian flu is a big threat, and there is billions of birds that fly from Siberia through Alaska down to the United States to Latin America in the wintertime. They live there, and then they go back in the summertime to Siberia. Well, the Fish and Game Office in the Department of the Interior had a whole monitoring system for birds that were dying when they're falling down. If the birds died, they take the carcass and they would analyze it to see if they had a virus, because it's a bird flu. And that was an early warning system within the United States. I don't know if you can do that all over the world. That would be too much, it seems to me. But, that's another way of, particularly in the United States, for bird flus.
Here's a question about global vaccine cooperation. What would that look like? And being, I guess, a little suspicious of China and Russia, perhaps, how could the U.S. impact a global vaccine effort in a positive way? Is that even possible Is it partnering with the EU or
Well,
European?
no, we already have a system for doing this. It started actually just before I became aid administrator in 2000, late 2000. And I think I may have signed the papers but it started during the late Clinton administration, just the last few months of the Clinton administration. It's called Gavi, Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations. We have a lot of vaccines right now for different diseases that are not being manufactured because there's no market for it. For example, and I'll tell you something that's disturbing to me. We have a house in Maine and we have epidemic levels of Lyme disease. There's a vaccine against Lyme disease. And, it's a lobster fisherman's village that we live in. We've had the house for almost 35 years now. And it's a devastating disease. There's a vaccine against it. You know why they don't produce it? Because of the lawsuits they're going to get. All these anti-vaccine people, they're constantly suing everybody. And the consequence is the vaccine manufacturers said, unless there's a huge demand and there's a public health emergency, and we're told we're not going to do it because we don't get sued. So Gavi is an effort. It has billions of dollars in it. The United States put money. The Gates Foundation put a lot of money in. And so did the Europeans. The Japanese put money in. What it does is it creates a market that's predictable for the vaccine manufacturers and the medication that's necessary. Because some diseases you fight with a pill, sometimes with a syringe, with a shot. And so it already exists. It's been around for 20 years. It works. We just need to expand it and make it for more diseases and more money into the vaccine area. A lot of it's in medication.
Question about the role of international NGOs in addressing the pandemic. Have they been engaged at all? Have they been helpful? What has been your observation?
Well, I don't have any choice. They got World Vision. When I don't know how many people they have now, but last time I checked, they have 50,000 employees in 105 countries. And then most of these are not Americans. They're from the developing world. And so their people get the disease themselves. They want to get their staff immunized. They also want to get the people in the villages immunized who are at risk. But the vaccine has to be available, and it's not available now because everybody's being parochial about it. Now, I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't immunize our people, but there is a way of sharing the technology that we have with other manufacturing facilities around the world that would allow because the developing world produces a lot of their own they have factories themselves that produce medication. India does, for example, on a large scale. The NGOs do, but they're not going to produce their own vaccines. They need the government and the pharmaceutical industry to do that. They have chains of health clinics all over the world. All of the great NGOs do that. And the international NGOs and local NGOs, both.
A question about this blame casting, and they said, isn't that really part of the reason that we're not succeeding in this? If we say it's their problem, it's China's fault, it's their problem. We use it to cast blame, and then countries won't be willing to supply data, let's say, to an early warning system. Be generally less cooperative, but I suppose that's politics, right? I mean, everybody's trying.
Well, it is politics, but I have to say, even if Donald Trump was not president, we'd be dealing with the same thing, because it was the very fact that this started in China is extremely damaging to the Chinese image in the world. I think it's actually done a lot of damage in the developing world, because I know African friends of mine are saying it's Chinese fault that this started and they didn't tell us. And I don't think the people in Beijing even knew this was going on in August. I think the local administrators, it's a new disease. It wasn't even covered in the incentive structure for reporting diseases because it didn't exist before. They hadn't identified it yet. And so they don't have, what Xi Jinping did is very, very interesting to read it. He announced in June that he was, it was April. It was April. He was filing legislation. It was in the Hong Kong Morning Post. Is that what it's called? It's the biggest English-speaking newspaper. South China Morning Post. It's the biggest English-speaking newspaper in Hong Kong, owned by Jack Ma, by the way, who's of course in big trouble in China now, but they reported it. He gave a talk, it's supposed to be classified, Xi Jinping, to the Central Committee of the Communist Party and announced that he was filing legislation. And he said it was modeled after the American system of public health in the United States. And he said, we're going to set up the best public health infrastructure in the world. They have very poor public health infrastructure, to be very frank with you. And so, no, they still practice this traditional Chinese medicine that has no scientific basis for a lot of it. I'm not being mean here, but I went to China and they're trying to sell me some of this stuff. And I said, come on. They have a completely different theory of the human body and all that. And that they're very nationalistic about it. And so when you say, well, I mean, is there any scientific evidence? And they said, oh, you Americans are being anti-Chinese. I said, I'm not being anti-Chinese, but I believe in science. Do you have evidence? They practice both kinds of science. They're wonderful Chinese scientists. And some of them, by the way, released the DNA analysis of the genome of the virus. And they have, I don't say they've disappeared, but their name is not on the university websites anymore. Their stuff has been removed. And some stories in the Post and the South China Morning Post is that they've been removed from their positions because they released the data without permission to the world, the scientific community. So I have to say, I think there are a lot of very brave Chinese scientists who are brilliant scientists. And I think it's regrettable that we're not involved more with. Now, many of them are still publishing articles. You see the Chinese articles in Lancet, the great British journal Public Health, and the New England Medical Association and all that have their own journals. And so they publish around the world. But some of the sensitive stuff China's not dealing with. And certainly the reporting that this thing started in late August, early September, that is, the Chinese are not going to admit that just because of the nature of it. Should we run around blaming them? No, but it is politics. But how are they responding? They're responding by using vaccines to get votes in the UN. I don't think that's very helpful either. So the Chinese government, separate from their scientific community, is not without blame in all this.
So Andrew, if you get a call from President Biden tomorrow morning and he says, okay, Andrew, I see you're stirring a pot down there in Texas a little bit. Tell me the top two things we should be doing right now. What would you tell him?
Well, I would tell them the pandemic early warning system, they have made to make a decision at the NSC with a presidential order and then file legislation to say AID or wherever you're going to locate it needs to be located. It should not be in the CIA. I don't care whether they have their own system or not. The CIA is seen as an instrument of intelligence and it's black ops and all that. If you really want to get the NGOs to cooperate in the UN and other countries, you cannot have this system located in the CIA or the State Department. They don't have the capacity to do it. Now, CDC does, but they did not perform that well in this emergency. And my own view is they're competing with AID all over the world now. They're trying to set up their own systems. It's very dysfunctional. And if AID weren't doing a good job, I could understand it, but they are doing a good job. And there's a lot of, AID's been at the forefront of a lot of the global health infrastructure that's been developed over the years. They're very operational. There are 80 missions around the world. And so I think a decision needs to be made so we don't have turf fights all the time on this stuff. That's the first thing I would suggest. The second is, I think he's already done it, but he needs to set back up the system of indicators. There were like 100 different indicators. One of them was the birds, falling from the air, their corpses being analyzed, and then the drug sales and all. But there are a whole bunch of other. I can't even remember all of them. He should set that system back up just to protect us. That's the second thing I would suggest. And then the third thing is the Stafford Act, which is the act used for FEMA to respond to emergencies. It specifically does not include health. And there is an act, Senator Byrd, by the way, he's retiring, senator from North Carolina. he is the co-author of the Emergency Pandemic and Early Warning, Pandemic and All Natural Hazards Act with Senator Ted Kennedy from Massachusetts, since died. But the two authors of that bill, one died and the other is not going to run for re-election. And that's unfortunate because we need advocates in the Senate and the House who are experts in this to get legislation through to settle some of these interagency disputes and turf wars. There are huge turf wars in the Trump administration, which are frankly going to continue in the Biden administration, because no one ever wanted to make a decision on how the system should work. When Congress doesn't want to deal something controversial, they say, "Oh, let the executive deal with it." Well, that, sometimes that makes things worse because it never gets dealt with. And the presidents deal with it by an executive order. You know how long an executive order or a president lasts? Until they leave office. The next president can just rescind it. I don't think that executive orders are the way we should be governing the country, myself, in any administration, Republican or Democratic.
Andrew, this has been a fascinating conversation, and we could talk for hours and hours and hours, but that's not fair to you. And we appreciate so much the insights you've had about us. We learned so much this evening. Thank you very much. If people want to keep track of what you're doing, the kind of ideas that you've been sharing with us, where can they go?
Well, we have a website. It's a platform actually connected to the Texas A&M library system. The Bush School of Government, which I teach in, is and the Scowcroft Institute, which is part of the Bush School, has this platform within the library system called the Scowcroft Infectious Disease Information Platform, CIDIP. I think it's on your web. You put it up on the website. Yep. You can go there, and we have all our white papers and our research reports. We have very famous epidemiologists like Michael Osterholm, who writes blogs for us. We published a book through Texas A&M Press, which was written before the pandemic. I asked Christy Blackburn, who was the editor, who was the deputy head of our pandemic program, to write a chapter on the global supply chains after the pandemic started. But that book is out now. We're also publishing a book on COVID-19 of essays through Texas A&M Press. And so that's one way. The other thing is you can just go to the Scowcroft Institute. We have 20 papers on a whole bunch of subjects, not just pandemics. And I have a LinkedIn account with about 5,000 followers, and I mostly people from the aid community and the development community. And you can go on to LinkedIn and link with me, and you can get, whenever we do anything, this will be posted, for example, on my LinkedIn account. Any article I write always gets posted there.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Andrew. Thanks for your expertise, your willingness to share with us, and a creative mind. I really, really appreciated this conversation very much. And folks, we will be archiving this on our YouTube channel, YouTube World Michigan, shortly too. And next Monday, we'll be back with you when our Great Decision series will go to global supply chains. We have Judy Samuelson from the Aspen Institute and Brian Krause, who's the Vice President for Global Manufacturing at Amway Corporation, talking about the future of business and global supply chains. That's next Monday at 6 o'clock. Join us tomorrow at 7 for the Global Mixer. You can register at worldmichigan.org/Great Decisions 2021. And we'll be talking about some of Andrew's ideas and other global issues. We would love to have you join us. Take care, stay safe, and may all everywhere in the world stay safe and well. Take care.
Thank you. Good night.